Joining me, Conservative MP Bob Seely, Labour MP Zara Sultana, The Guardian's Aubrey Allegretti and former Conservative political advisor Anita Boateng. Today,
teachers have seen a long-term and very severe cut in their pay in real terms, and that's been accompanied by a huge increase in workload.
The most important thing for us to do as the government is to halve inflation, is to get inflation down so that everybody feels better off.
hundreds of thousands of teachers, train drivers and civil servants out on strike. Who will blink first, the government or the unions?
They've made the promises, but then they're taking back the promises. And it seems to be something that's just happening to the Windrush victims time and time again.
Why victims of the Windrush scandal say they're being betrayed by government.
The way we vote is changing.
You'll need ID to vote in May's elections. Will people be turned away?
I would just gently remind him he thought the member for Islington North was the right person to look after our security. Well, it was a few years ago. He was supporting the member for Islington North. For 4 long years, he sat next to the member for Islington North.
Why does Rishi Sunak so often refer to the former Labour leader at Prime Minister's Questions? And we'll bring you today's question and answer session live at noon. So hundreds of thousands of workers are taking part in what's probably the biggest day of strike action in decades. Teachers and train drivers are among them. Let's have a look at some of the front pages, starting with the Daily Telegraph. Teachers in walkout could still be paid, is their headline. In The Guardian, it's 500,000 to strike as unions warn talks are going backwards. And in The Mail, their headline is a cynical walkout that betrays our children again. We asked the question, or posed it at least in the headlines. I'll put it to the panel now, starting with you, Bob. Who is going to blink first in this dispute, the government or the unions?
I'm not going to put it in terms of such confrontational terms, because I think it's unhelpful. I think what the government needs to do...
Isn't it a reality?
What the government needs to do is bring down inflation, as Gillian said. It needs to bring down inflation for everybody. And so we can't have inflation-busting pay rises. When it comes to education and schools specifically, the facts are these. If you're an experienced teacher, the pay offer is 5%. If you are a new teacher, the pay offer is very near the level of inflation at 8.9%. There's also progression pay rises, which could help another 40% of teachers.
So they should just accept it?
Well, we need to get inflation down for everybody. We've promised to get it down, halve it this year, and after that we need to get it down further, because as Gillian says, getting inflation down makes everybody better off and it becomes less painful for everybody.
Zara?
So that's what we need to do.
Zara?
Well, I was at an NEU picket this morning and the teachers there don't want to be on strike. They want to be teaching kids, and them going on strike is a very difficult decision, but they haven't seen their pay increase. It's 13% less than it was when the Tories came into power. With increasing workloads, tension and stress, there's so much pressure on teachers and so many are choosing to leave the profession. So this is a measure of last resort, and they're having to do this because negotiations and conversations with the government haven't succeeded thus far.
Aubrey, who is going to blink first? Bob says that's confrontational, but that is the reality here. There's very little movement on either side.
Well, absolutely. The government is trying to paint this as an argument that says there can be no exceptions, that all public sector workers have to accept the Independent Pay Review Body recommendations. Now, they are, of course, picking a rather brave political fight, because there are some Conservative MPs who feel that there should have been an exception made for health workers, and that hasn't happened. Now, the progress that we've heard about doesn't seem to be happening. The government indicated there might be some wiggle room for manoeuvre on pay if there was progress on efficiency savings. But that stonewalling, again, is creating more bad blood between the unions and the government.
Is the government going to continue to resist the pressure that's being put upon them on a day of action like this?
I think it's a very different proposition to have teachers striking, because that does impact a lot of the workforce, because you have a lot of people that have to stay at home to look after their children. So I think this is one of the first strikes that will be felt very widely across the economy. It's maybe not, it's not going to be revolutionary, because a lot of people work from home now. But in terms of the question of how we end up getting out of this situation, I think that looking forward to the next pay settlement seems to be a place where the government is willing to kind of show more flexibility. I think we might end up in a bit of a logjam if we continue with the kind of current stasis that's happening. I think ultimately Pupils are really suffering. They've gone through a really tumultuous time. I completely accept and agree with Zara, actually, that teachers have gone through a very difficult time too. It just feels that when you look at the economic situation the government faces and the need to get rid of the backlogs in education as well as in the health system, there isn't a lot of flexibility the government can really show there.
Do you think there should be a special case for teachers?
Well, the average teacher, okay, let's look at teachers and the train drivers, because Anita makes a good point. The average teacher earns just shy of £40,000. So they're actually a lot better off. The average teacher earns nearly £40,000. So they're a lot better off than a lot of the parents of the kids they teach. The average train driver earns, depending on overtime, between 60 and 100,000. And actually, at the next election, there's going to be, you know, the politics of this. At the next election, there's going to be a simple choice that we, on the side of the workers, we want people to get to work. We're bringing in minimum service levels, which will be scrapped by the Labour Party. And the Labour Party have taken 125 million from the unions in the last 10 years. So, of course, they're going to do the unions' bidding.
Trade union donations are the cleanest money in politics, and if every Tory MP declared their second jobs, donations from oil and gas, billionaires and all sorts of other vested interests, I don't think we'd get through many debates in Parliament if they were just declaring their interests. On the point about minimum service levels, if this government truly cared about safety, you'd think they'd mention it at least once in the bill. It doesn't get mentioned even once. It gives wide-ranging powers to the Secretary of State, who will define what minimum safety levels are, which is incredibly authoritarian. And also, if this was a measure to solve the current disputes, it's not going to. It's making the situation worse. And if this government cared about minimum service levels, they should have them on non-strike days. In the NHS, there are already chronic shortages in beds, in staffing. If we look across the public sector, that is the case. In schools, there are shortages. Rather than address those fundamental issues, this is about fighting with the unions, because I guess the government doesn't like strong unions fighting for their workers and advocating for their interests.
Bob?
Sorry, Zara. I mean, we would love folks to be working, and the idea that we go around picking battles with the unions is nonsense.
This is exactly what's happening,
but we need to have minimum service levels. If it's such a draconian measure, why does France have it? Why does Germany have it?
We have stronger unions. We have some of the most restrictive
anti-union
legislation in the Western world, and this will make it even worse.
They have unions that work with governments, work with industries in a way that some of the more left-wing unions in this country simply don't want. They want to be divisive.
So, Bob, why doesn't Brian Chaps want to meet with RMT and other unions to resolve these disputes? Why are the government
government ministers have met with unions, but actually it's the train companies responsible for striking the contracts and striking the deals. But I come back to this central point. We're on the side of the workers. You're not.
That's
125.
Untrue.
You've taken 125 million from the unions.
I have not personally
since
taken 125 million
MPs, Labour MPs, constituency associations and the Labour Party have taken 125 million
and how much
from the
has the
unions.
Conservative Party taken from oil and gas, from billionaires, from landlords and property developers and all sorts of other damaging interests?
Your policies are paid for by the unions. That's why you are opposing. That's why, Zara, you're opposing the minimum strikes.
Very clean
and at the next election, you'll be saying you'll be withdrawing this bill, and we'll be saying we need to get this bill in because it's a bill like the French have, like the Germans have, to make sure there are minimum service
little in common with Jacob Rees-Mogg, but even he said the bill...
But fair point. I give you that much.
We'll be talking to Mick Whelan, who's the General Secretary of ASLEF, the train drivers' union that has been mentioned in this discussion after Prime Minister's questions, so around 12:30. Let's move on. Let me show you this headline in The Independent. Lib Dem peer Fluella Benjamin hits out at government's disrespect of Windrush generation. This is in response to a U-turn on key reform pledges that were made by the government. Initially, the government adopted all 30 of the proposals in the report that was carried out by Wendy Williams, but has now backtracked on 3 of them. That's to establish a Migrants Commissioner, to increase the powers of the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, and hold reconciliation events. Is that the right decision, Bob?
OK, I didn't... because I needed to find out more about this, I spoke to the Home Office SPADs this morning.
Special advisors.
Sorry, I do apologise. We don't want to use acronyms, so special advisors. And what they say is that out of the 30 recommendations made, 21 were effectively dealt with by last March. And so we're working on another 9 that were still outstanding. Let me just make the point. £64 million has been paid out in compensation. When it comes to those 3 issues, the civil servants' advice, it's not a political... The politicians aren't doing this off their own bat. The officials' advice, the advice from the civil servants, is that the 3 items, including reconciliation events, are not necessarily best done by government, although some 200 such events have already taken place.
Although, interestingly, the government did accept everything at the beginning.
It did, but it's now, based on the civil servants' own advice, those 3 items are best dealt with by by bits apart from the government.
Do you accept that as a justification?
No, because the Windrush scandal was a shocking injustice to people who lost their homes, jobs, some were deported, some people died before any kind of justice took place for them. And there are issues also with the compensation scheme. There are more people who have been rejected than payments that have been paid out to them. And then when we look at the government, when it deals with scandals like this, it apologises, says it's going to look into recommendations and implement them, and then turns around and doesn't do that. The same with the second job scandal and even with Grenfell as well.
Right, well, I mean, just sticking with this, is this a bit of an own goal by the Home Office?
Well, I think when I remember reading the 30 recommendations from Wendy Williams when they came out, and I've got to say the reconciliation events was the one that I kind of went, ooh, those will need to be handled carefully, because I think that sometimes...
But does that mean they're wrong?
Well, community outreach is really important, and it seems from the written statement from the Home Secretary that there have been a lot of these community engagement events. I just think they need to be carefully done. So I can see a world in which you may end up not doing those in the exact same form as recommended, but you bring something that keeps the spirit of that. The question, though, of external scrutiny is the other 2 recommendations, where I think perhaps, I mean, it's always challenging when you have and you create these new bodies or with increased powers to scrutinise, but that may end up serving and adding to some element of integrity. So I'll be interested to see how the Home Office kind of navigates that question, where I think there is probably more questions.
I mean, there is a sense of betrayal. We heard it there in the headlines from someone who suffered as a result of the scandal, you know, British residents perhaps being threatened with deportation. Is that overplayed, then, the sense of betrayal?
Well, I think what Bob was talking about was very interesting. If there are perfectly reasonable reasons why in the last few years the advice has changed from officials about why to do this...
Last few months.
Then it would be more helpful to explain why that change has taken place, because it's not a case of just kind of the Home Office making a decision. You need to bring people with you and realise the damage that was done, explain that so that they still have confidence, even though these recommendations they were told were coming into effect aren't.
I completely agree. Look, I agree absolutely with Zara says. This is an awful series of events, and actually really shameful. Government has committed to putting it right. By last March, we had already fulfilled 2/3 of the recommendations. We were working on the last 9. You're absolutely right, Anita, about the reconciliation. Actually, if government was doing the reconciliation itself, you can guarantee people would say they don't trust the process because it's being handled by the Home Office, so they would want somebody independent doing it. So actually, a lot of this is being on those 3 changes, which have happened in the last few months, Aubrey, then I think it's very understandable why this is being done, and it's probably being done to give it greater credibility. This is why I got on the phone this morning before coming on the programme, because I wanted to know for myself why we were not putting in those 3. So it's not a question of reneging on them. Actually, there are better ways of achieving a reconciliation process, and there have already been 200 outreach meetings, so it's not as if none have happened.
Well, do you accept that things might have changed, that this might be a more productive way of actually meeting some of the commitments that are being made?
I think it's really important to centre the victims of the scandal, and like the interview we heard, where they're not happy with what is happening through the Home Office, I think it's important to platform those and listen to those concerns and move forward with the Home Office listening to those.
But Zara, if the Home Office ran the reconciliation meetings themselves, I can well imagine, with the best will in the world, you will turn around and say the Home Office shouldn't be doing that because the Home Office was part of the problem. So what we're trying to do is say, actually, the Home Office may not be the best person, that actually independent groups, NGOs, may be a better bet to lead a process that's got credibility. So that, for me, that's what I'm reading into this decision anyway.
But what about the external scrutiny, as Anita sees it? Why are those two being involved?
I don't know. I mean, I tried to get as much steer and information from the Home Office this morning, and I focused on the reconciliation stuff, because that seemed to be absolutely the most important, because that was a very public-facing aspect, that people need to have their stories heard, they need to be listened to, and actually, for me, probably the Home Office, because it was part of the problem, is not necessarily the organisation that should be leading this process.
All right. When voters in England and Wales go to the polls in the May elections this year, they're going to be required for the first time to bring proof of ID. The Electoral Commission has been pushing an information campaign to make sure that voters are actually aware of the new requirement. However, this headline in The Guardian underlines a potential issue. Only 10,000 people in Great Britain have applied for government-issued voter ID. We can have a look here also at the list of ID that will be acceptable. You can see the long list there. People will need that, otherwise they will be turned away when they come to vote. Why do we need this, Bob, particularly? I mean, what's the evidence of widespread electoral fraud?
Well, I think there's a very, very simple principle behind this, and it's one that personally, Joe, I completely support, that if you're going to vote, voting is one of the most important things that we do in this country.
Yes.
And to make sure our system remains clean and remains credible, it is perfectly acceptable to ask people to produce ID when voting. In the same way that if you look young enough, and sadly those days are past for me, if you're going to go and have a drink and you go into the pub and you may be asked for proof of age, you take ID to a pub. You take ID when you're going abroad.
It's a perfectly reasonable move.
By the government's own declarations, only 6 cases of electoral ballot fraud took place at the last general election. So this...
Provable.
This policy is incredibly harmful for nearly 2 million people who don't possess photo ID, while the government has introduced measures. Less than 0.5% of the people that need photo ID have got that voluntary ID certification. And if we look at the list of ID that's acceptable, there's discrepancies between an Oyster card for someone who's over 60 and a young person's Oyster card. If we look at an older person's bus pass but not a young person's bus pass and rail pass. So there seems to be unfairness in the way some of this identification will be acceptable. But also, this is straight out of the Republicans' handbook from the US. It makes it harder to vote, and it's the people who are already underrepresented who are going to be disproportionately hit by this.
Do you agree with that, Anita?
No, and I think the politicisation of this issue just honestly is really damaging to politics in general. The fundamental situation is that if we take a long-term view, it's probably better for our electoral system that there is some kind of rigour around the process of voting. We use ID when we go to collect a parcel. In Northern Ireland, they've had it for about 20 years. Like, there are very reasonable things that you could see in the long term would benefit and add to the integrity of our electoral system. That's not about saying the system is currently rife with fraud. It's just saying, in general, it would be better. You've got to do it in a way that is careful, and you've got to do it in a way that allows people to adjust and adapt. And I do think that ultimately, when we talk about and we politicise this issue, we're not talking about Northern Ireland. We always talk about the US, which has an entirely different electoral system. And I really think that it fundamentally destroys trust in our electoral system. And I think that the measures the government have put in place around this have been fairly careful, and I think it's going to move us in a direction that our politics in general should go.
Aubrey?
Well, the argument is that the government is moving too quickly on this, and it's not bringing people with them quickly enough, because obviously the local elections are in May. There's only been 0.5% of people who don't have this kind of ID who've said to have got it in the past 2 weeks. That, at the current rate, we're told it will take about 8 years for the number of people who haven't got it to get it.
But the problem with that argument, I mean, as ever, I think Anita summed it up incredibly eloquently. But when it comes to, if we didn't have it for this election, everyone would say, oh, you bring it in for the general election, why haven't you brought it in beforehand? We're trying to bring it in for this election now to make sure that the process actually works like it should. And actually, I agree with Anita. The politicisation of this is really unnecessary. Nobody thinks that having ID in Northern Ireland is somehow disruptive to democracy there. And actually, we don't know, Zara, just on the point of fraud, we don't know how much fraud takes place in the system, because just because only 6 people have been prosecuted, it doesn't mean that there are a small number of additional cases or many hundreds of thousands.
You both put this allegation of politicising this. Is that what's happening?
I believe that the government has politicise this issue because there isn't evidence for this kind of policy. And instead, when we look at who's going to be impacted, the data shows that these are people who will probably vote for the Labour Party. So what we see with the government is just by hook or crook trying to hold on to power. And we see with a whole raft of policies that they've brought through, that's exactly what they're doing.
I mean, is that the risk? You're going to disenfranchise the sorts of people, groups of people who might vote
Has
Labour.
that happened in Northern Ireland?
That was going to be my question. So I mean, what we've got to do is absolutely make sure that everyone who wants to vote can vote and they can participate in the process. And what you're going to, we've done pilots around this that has been tested, and a lot of people, for instance, go home and collect ID. A lot of people voting for the first time are quite surprised that they don't need to bring anything with them. I do think that ultimately we've got the elections coming up quickly. We need to make sure people are aware of this. People will adjust, and I think it will happen fairly quickly. And maybe I'm not surprised to hear that people aren't all, sadly, watching programmes like this to know that this is coming in.
A lot of people are, Anita.
But I think they will adjust when it comes to that first election, and we will see a ground shift. And this conversation that helps people to believe there's some kind of conspiracy against them voting really damages trust in politics. And I think that is disenfranchising, not this.
Has Anita convinced you?
No, absolutely not. Further to the points I was making was that local councils just haven't been given the support and the advice to be able to implement this in time.
I got a letter from my local council today saying we're checking who's registered to vote. They're doing it at the moment.
I mean, the thing is your sort of objection, if I can call it that, Aubrey, a practical one rather than a political one? I mean, is there a risk that there'll be a lot of young people who perhaps don't get their ID in time or bring it to the ballot box, to the voting booth?
I think that's been a concern raised by the Electoral Commission itself, that essentially this is all being quite rushed and they can't guarantee how well the election will be able to be run in May. And obviously we've talked about the fact that, people are not exactly completely hooked. It's hard enough to get people to register to vote, let alone to then kind of get them to register to have the right ID for it. So there will come a point much closer to polling day probably where there's a big scramble, and then we see the sort of calculation about how many people do we think that this is going to sort of tighten up the rules and regulations around how many fewer instances of voter fraud might there be versus how many people are turned away from polling stations. Is that number really going to be smaller?
I mean, are you going to call for it to be postponed, this move, or scrapped altogether?
I'd like it to be scrapped entirely. I would want us to have a system where it's easy to vote, where more people are able to vote and more people want to vote, and I feel like this will only make it harder.
I mean, that is the point. You do want as many people to vote as possible, don't you?
Yeah, you do, for sure, and that's why we need to advertise what we're doing to make sure people are aware. But you also need you need integrity in the system, and as Anita says, actually, every time I turn up to vote, I'm surprised that people don't ask for any ID. You could turn up and say, give whatever name you wanted. And OK, if they've already voted, you're going to have a problem explaining yourself. But if you go early enough, you could literally choose to be any person, and you don't have to have identification. It seems bizarre that we've had a system which is so sort of trusting for so long, and actually just having basic ID with you. As Anita said, you have ID when you're picking up a parcel. That is not as important as voting. You have ID when you go to the pub. Yeah, that is not as important as voting. You probably take your driving licence when you're driving. Not all the time, I don't. I hope that's... is that the law?
Let's not discuss your personal idea where you failed to...
Zara makes the point about making it easier to vote. I don't think it's difficult to vote now. And I think it's right. I think we absolutely need to move to a system where more people are confident about the process and have their ID. And I think there's never going to be a perfect time to do this. But I do think, on balance, if we bite the bullet and do this now, it will help improve the integrity of our system and trust in our system in the next couple of decades. And I think that is worth doing.
Right.
I think what we've seen in Northern Ireland, if we look at the data, trust in the integrity of the process, obviously there was a very different context in which it was brought in, but the trust in the integrity of the process is pretty high now as a result of that. So I think it is an important measure in the long view.
Let's talk about Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the Labour Party. He hasn't been in that position since 2020, but he does crop up rather a lot in political debate, and particularly at Prime Minister's questions. Let's have a listen.
Mr. Speaker, the difference between him and me is that I stand by my values and my principles, even when it is difficult. When I disagreed fundamentally with the previous Prime Minister, I resigned from the government. But for four long years, he sat next to the member for Islington North. When anti-Semitism ran rife, when his predecessor sided with our opponents. That's what's weak, Mr. Speaker. He has no principles and just petty politics.
Well, that was Rishi Sunak, and we'll hear from him again in about 20 minutes' time for Prime Minister's Questions today. We're joined now by Joe Twyman from Delta pollster. Joe, is this sort of line of attack from the Prime Minister working?
Well, the fact that Labour are, in some polls, more than 20 points ahead suggests it's probably not. But at the same time, you can, from a certain point of view, understand why the Conservatives are pushing this. In the words of the great philosopher John Bon Jovi, you live for that fight when it's all that you've got. There is a lot of evidence to show that Labour are consistently ahead when it comes to all of the major issues when given the choice between Labour and Conservatives. And so what can you go for? Well, you can go for the historical damage that Jeremy Corbyn did to the popularity of Labour and his performance at the last election, and you can try and tie Keir Starmer to that. The difficulty is that it doesn't really wash with voters. More than nearly two-thirds of Labour voters believe that Jeremy Corbyn is not as good as Keir Starmer. They believe that Keir Starmer is better. Only around about 1 in 10 believe that it's Jeremy Corbyn who is the better leader of the two. And so this is an attempt, I think, to as I say, tie Keir Starmer to an unpopular figure who remains unpopular in the country as a whole. But at the same time, I think it's an attempt to create a sort of division and perhaps a sign of disunity within Labour, and perhaps to poke certain sections of the party in the hope that they will respond in a way that is helpful to the Conservatives.
Bob, it's not working.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, and I do think it's important to remind people. And I think there's a very simple principle here, that Keir Starmer stood alongside and supported Jeremy Corbyn's leadership when Jeremy Corbyn was anti-NATO, was making excuses for Putin's poisoning in Salisbury, when Corbyn was coming out with a whole host of hard-left Marxist policies, including being almost pro-Brexit. I mean, it's one sensible thing he's come out with. So, and I do think it's useful to remind people of that Starmer was very happy to sit with this Marxist former leader of the Labour Party. So it's very difficult for Starmer to say now, oh, I'm pro-NATO and I'm pro-this and I'm pro-that, when he was happy not to be under previous leadership.
Zara?
I think it's quite embarrassing when Rishi Sunak keeps bringing up Jeremy Corbyn's name. The reason being is it seems quite obvious that they are devoid of any kind of ideas and policies that would actually excite the public or win them over, and the polls show that. So keep bringing Jeremy seems to be the policy or the plan, and it isn't obviously working, but that doesn't mean that they're going to stop.
I mean, would you be advising this, Anita, if you were working for a government minister or Rishi Sunak in terms of Labour's 20 points ahead consistently?
Well, I think there's more nuance in this approach than is being recognised. And I think the reality of the situation is that actually voters don't know who Keir is, and they don't understand Keir. They don't know what he stands for, and they see him as defined in opposition. So effectively, he kind of just doesn't like whatever the government's doing. So when Zara talks about being devoid of ideas, I smiled because I thought she was referring to the Labour Party.
So did I.
And I think that actually the fact that they don't know who he is means that they're casting around for what is he like? Who does he remind me of? And he certainly doesn't remind the voters of Blair, right? This is not a 1997 moment. And so the last leader was Corbyn. He supported Corbyn. So Keir, is he a bit like Corbyn? And I think there is a big weakness here that Labour is failing to recognise, in that their leader has no identity and people don't know what he believes and they don't know his vision. And I think that is a bruise that Rishi can keep pressing on.
Aubrey?
I think really this device that's being used by Rishi Sunak is not so...
I'm fucking done. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I literally can't listen to this fucking utter propaganda bollocks. It's so crazy. I don't even miss streaming this shit at this point. I literally don't, because it's the same fucking right-wing bollocks. What's your job? What's your job? I used to be a Tory advisor. What's your job? I used to be a Tory advisor. What's your job? I work for the BBC and vote Tory. What's your job? I'm a Tory. What's your job? I'm a Labour MP. Does anybody fucking say anything? That's a pattern here. 4 Tories, 1 Labour Party activist. And she's only like 20 odd. God bless her soul. I fucking hate this fucking goddamn fucking shit.